Well, hello, my name is Vasilios Kosmakos. Today is March 8th, 2022. Who do I have the pleasure with speaking with today?
So my name is Dora DeMaria, and I'm the Education Director for Reef Relief.
Fantastic. So if you can just tell me a little bit about yourself, Maria, where did you grow up, that type of thing.
Yeah, so I was born in Key West. I grew up down here. I went to Key West High School. I went away to Florida State for college, and then I came back and started interning at Reef Relief. Growing up, my parents were very heavily involved in marine science. My mom is a marine biologist, and my father was a commercial fisherman turned conservationist. So at a very early age, I was very highly exposed to different scientists, different issues going on in our marine ecosystems, and getting to experience it firsthand, and experiencing the scientists and researchers and what they're, trying to communicate with the public about, sometimes struggling to communicate, and just seeing certain degradation in our ecosystems. But that really inspired me to want to pursue marine science going forward, and being down here at Reef Relief has given me the tools to give back to an ecosystem that essentially raised me as a child.
So you your parents come from an interesting background, right? You said your mother was a marine biologist, your father was a fisherman turned conservationist. How did that kind of perspective influence you growing up? What type of things did you essentially talk about at the dinner table, and how have you realized that those conversations differed from maybe the things or ideas you were exposed to in college?
Yeah, so having a father that comes from two very almost polarizing backgrounds was really interesting. So, he started as a commercial fisherman down here and witnessed the effect and the impact that what he was doing had on the ecosystems, and realized that he needed to make a change. And he's really shown me a good balance between, using the ocean as a resource, but also protecting it. And I think a lot of people fail to recognize that. And some people think it's black and white. We kill everything or we protect everything. And you can marry both, so that way people are all happy, people are still able to live. I mean, again, like the house over my head, the food on the table was supplied by fisheries, essentially. And so I was really exposed to very different ways of thinking and experiencing my father navigating these different ways of thinking as well. I would watch him interact with people that are very angry about some of the fishery proposals he would be pushing for, and then by the end of the discussion they would be more understanding and they would see more eye to eye. With my mom, I would watch her dissect the fish in our yard, and when she was at work I would get to look at all the cool tanks going on. My dad would help her get the fish to do life history studies. So it was really cool. And again, seeing a bunch of scientists that would come in and hang out and kind of like go on the boat with my dad was really, really cool. Basically, like what my dad did is he was one of the main voices to protecting the Goliath grouper. So he faced a lot of backlash from that, which I have kind of learned more in my adult years, just how, intense some of that actually was. But because he was a commercial fisherman and fished those, he knew a lot about them. So scientists would come down and actually stay with us so he could take them out and show them, all right, this is where they are juveniles now, this is where they used to aggregate, this is where they no longer are. So that was really kind of a cool experience, and I would get to go on the boat with them sometimes and really see it too.
So the Goliath grouper right now very hot by an issue, right? They just opened season up again. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Talk to us about why the Goliath grouper is important, a little bit of its life history, and then go from there and I'll ask you another question.
Yeah, so the Goliath grouper is a really slow-growing species, and they used to have a much larger range than they do today. They would extend south, way through the Caribbean, and all the way north as well. But now you really only see them around South Florida. Their areas for spawning is much smaller and much more limited now. And they are very important because everything in the ecosystems do have a role to create that balance. And once you start to remove something from there, it becomes to be problematic. Even currently right now, our Goliath groupers have learned how to consume lionfish, which is invasive. So that's really beneficial. But, they are incredibly important, and they take so long to grow, and they're honestly pretty friendly species for the most part. I've dove with them so many times, and, they'll get up in your business, and you're like, all right, we gotta back off, bud. but they're really no threat. A lot of people like to blame them for the lack of other animals, such as lobsters. But in reality, it's humans that are, taking all the lobsters out of the ocean. It's not these groupers. They've been here much longer. There was a lot more of them, and there was more lobsters then. And people get mad at them for taking their catch when they're fishing. And, they're opportunistic. I like to kind of make the analogy. Humans like fast food. We go to McDonald's. It's kind of the same thing for sharks and groupers. If there's an easy fish, why not go for it? Especially if we're removing most of their other diets. And, it has been found that the things that they're claiming that Goliaths eat really isn't true. They eat a lot of really small things like shrimp, a lot of things just hanging out on the bottom. They've done a lot of stomach content analysis on them, and they're not eating the big things, the snappers, the other groupers, the bigger lobsters like people are assuming that they are eating.
So, I mean, you said that they were, you were getting friendly with them, right? Goliath grouper is a humongous fish, right? I mean, I think up to a couple 100 pounds, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they eat sharks sometimes, right? I mean, they're that big. I mean, but now you're saying that they eat kind of the smaller stuff. I mean, kind of discuss that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's really confusing, and I don't have all the details, but from what I have read and researched and learned about through my father's colleagues, especially Dr. Chris Koenig, he has done most of the research on it, and they did stomach content analysis of them through stable isotopes and found that they're mostly eating things like small shrimp and small other little fish. Very small things, because for the most part, they're kind of lazy. They sit and hang out. They don't swim that fast compared to a lot of other things. So their food is kind of limited in that respect. But yeah, it is kind of interesting to think about that. But if you want to compare it to like a whale shark, for example, whale sharks are massive, the biggest shark species we have. But they eat small things like shrimp, plankton, krill, and same with the blue whale, right? The largest animal on the planet eats the smallest stuff. So it's not out of the ordinary for big things to eat small stuff, but it is also why they have such a high level of mercury in their meat, which makes them toxic to eat, because they're eating those small level things, and it just gathers up in their tissue over time.
So now just give me your perspective on kind of the new regulations that kind of just took place, right? Where it is being opened back up. There's a little bit of a kind of chasm I think I'm seeing between what scientists are saying, what fishermen are saying. Given your background, what do you think that balance is? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, from what I'm understanding, for the most part, a lot of the scientists are saying that it is not ready to be opened up yet. I think there's a general consensus on that from what I've been reading, and from a lot of people that depend on Goliaths as a source of income in terms of tourism. They're worth much more alive than dead. So in my personal experience, I do see most people saying, no, they're not ready to be harvested yet. They haven't been restored to historical numbers. But on the other side, you do have people that want to have the enjoyment of fishing them like their grandparents did back in the day. So it is kind of having to make that balance. But for the most part, I don't believe it is ready to be harvested. So there could be a stark decline when it opens back up. However, from also what I'm seeing and reading, even fisher people are not too happy about it due to the size regulations. It doesn't look like the best scenario or situation.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's through this project we're interviewing a lot of scientists, but we're also interviewing a lot of fishermen. And I've always kind of found that, the person who deals with the resource every single day has a pretty thorough knowledge about it. So
yeah.
I don't think it's important. You shouldn't discount what the fisherman is saying, right? Just because you don't have the PhD. But in this case, right, it's I guess it's kind of not either or, right? You kind of need to look at the situation holistically to understand which side is kind of making the better argument, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think all across the board with every issue that we have, you run into that problem, in that there's a lapse between many different parties and many different interests.
So then, how did your father specifically kind of find that balance? You mentioned before how your father kind of made the argument that it's a balance between conservation and usage, right? Kind of describe what his perspective on it and describe your perspective on it. Yeah,
I mean, I have fairly similar perspective as him, just because it's been part of my life for so long. But yeah, it's that they're not ready to be harvested, and there's really no worth in doing it. It's not like getting them is an achievement. Like I said, they're fairly friendly in a sense, and it's not hard to, get a Goliath grouper. They're right there. They kind of stay in the same spot. Most people know where they're hanging out. They're not going to swim away really fast for the most part. They're kind of big targets. So there's no real like sport in it, which a lot of people are after. So, it just doesn't seem like it's really necessary.
More generally, what do you think that balance is in fishing overall? What do you think the balance is in fisheries overall? Going off that theme.
Yeah, so a lot of people want to say no more fishing, all of that, but I don't believe in that because so much of the planet relies on commercial fishing. And without that resource, then there's going to be a huge problem, and many people cannot afford to live. Growing up, I was dependent on that resource as well. And I think there is a good balance between fishing and conservation. But it has to come with, your intent and the intent of the person. Are they going out there with the intent to kill everything and not understanding that if they do that, although that day they have a lot, are they going to have that much in a few years when they go out again? So, it's really trying to make people understand that, yeah, you could get a bunch right now, but then in a few years when you want to go back out and do that with your kids or for your own business, that might not be there anymore, and you don't really want to risk that. So it's, not wanting to remove everything at one time and kind of having people understand that mindset. And some people never will, unfortunately. But if you can explain to people, how about we do this and maybe don't make an extreme change, but kind of have them change over time. That's kind of what we did here at Reef with plastic straws as well. Like, you don't want to just make a big change because people are really not good with change. People are scared of it. So you do have to kind of ease them into something, and then they'll kind of learn. Like, now we're like, okay, we don't need a plastic straw. But at the beginning, people were like, no, I need a straw. Like, I need it. So we're like, okay, well, how about we just don't put the straw in a drink automatically? And they have to ask, or maybe a different alternative. And now we've kind of learned a little bit more, like, all right, we can handle this. Yeah. So things like that. And just, I believe more, and I guess not a black and white, we need to do this and end it all. I believe more in like people need to adjust in order to have an actual change of thought and action.
It's a gradient, right?
Yeah.
It's like slowly but surely, right? It's like the spectrum of acceptable opinion becomes more one way than another, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So now circling back to your kind of work in Reef Relief, right? How did you get here, and kind of discuss what you got your bachelor's in and how you, like I said, the journey from your bachelor's to Reef Relief.
Yeah, so I always knew that I wanted to pursue marine science, marine conservation. I found early on that I'm not the best in terms of like laboratory work and analytical work, but I've really enjoyed communicating it with others. So when I came back down here after college, I found an internship here, and kind of things worked out in the sense that a few people were leaving, so I was able to get hired on as an education coordinator. Then I got promoted to education manager, and now I'm education director. And there's only 4 staff right now, so we're very small. But it's been really fun, and I get to go into the classrooms that I grew up in, which is really exciting. I also do swim lessons in my spare time, so I've been able to know a lot of these kids from that and seeing them here as well. But it's been really fun. I've taught thousands and thousands of kids, and as of this current school year, since September, myself and Erin, our coordinator, have taught over 7,000 students during COVID, which was a really exciting, During COVID, we actually offered free marine science lessons on Facebook Live, 3 a week, and we've had over 200,000 views. We had people from literally all over the planet. I had people messaging me in the United Arab Emirates. I had people, I believe, in the Middle East actually too, were watching and like tuning in to learn about these things. Even though they're nowhere near it, the ocean still affects everyone to some degree. So it was really, really cool to see and have that impact. And that also showed us that we could teach virtually as well. So we've been able to get into, I believe, a little over 35 states this school year. So that's been really awesome. And we
Relief?
Yes.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
And then thank you. And then around 7 different countries this school year as well.
Wow.
But it's really been awesome to see the impact that we're having. At the end, the kids will make comments or questions, and quite a few of them are really in awe of what lies beneath the ocean. They had no idea. And I actually did have a student from New York over Zoom. He came up and he said, thank you for teaching us about this. He was in 5th grade. And he was like, I had no idea these coral reefs even existed, and I want to do everything I can to make a difference and help save them. And that was just super heartwarming. And things like that make it really exciting. And you're like, okay, yes, I'm making a difference. Even though it's not like I see the corals are sprouting up right now, I'm making a difference long term. And we're fostering the next generation of conservationists, which in my eyes is really important.
So kind of discuss kind of the impact you think you think you've been having, right? So it's like when you talk to these kids, what do you think? What do you want these kids to leave out of to leave with? For every lesson.
So we want our students, our campers, whichever they are, however they interact with us, we want them to understand the issues that are happening. We don't want to, hide the fact that things are not well, but we also want them to leave feeling empowered that they can make a difference, because it is true. I am a firm believer that small efforts can make a big difference. And that's what I want every child to leave with, in that, if they do a few things, if they even tell someone else that didn't know, they are making an impact. And I want them to not leave feeling defeated, but leave feeling inspired. And I think that's really important, because if you leave feeling defeated and you have everyone leaving feeling defeated, they're not going to do anything. They're going to say, okay, all hope is lost. Why should I bother? But if you give them the inspiration and the tools and the knowledge to move forward and make an impact, you're going to see results in some way, shape, or form. And that's kind of what we want to do with these kids. We do actually pre and post test our campers and our kids in our middle school program, and always see an increase in testing scores and knowledge. And it's really cool, especially in summer camp. We've had a lot more out-of-town visitors coming in, just because they've heard about us through our Facebook Live events as well. And seeing those kids especially go from never seeing the coral reef before to sprouting every little fact about the ocean, it's awesome. And having like a 7-year-old tell me that oxybenzone and octinoxate is bad for the ocean, and having like a 6-year-old identify the operculum on a fish, that's insane. That's so fun.
So you kind of mentioned you provide them with knowledge, but you also provide them with tools, right? Mm-hmm. Kind of break that down for us a little bit more. What do you, in terms of knowledge, kind of what do you typically teach them, and in terms of tools, right? What do you typically kind of leave them with to kind of go out and make that change? Yeah.
So in general, we have around 12 to 14 different lesson topics, which we do adjust based on the teacher's needs. Maybe something is being emphasized in their current curriculum, because we kind of want to, help boost what they're learning, and it kind of helps with them in retention, so we can reference what they're doing, and then the teacher can go back and reference as well. I'm
sorry, can you give us some examples of the type of topics?
Yeah. So we do introduction to coral reefs, marine ecosystems, shark biology, fish anatomy, sea turtles, seabirds, oceanography, climate change, plastic, water quality.
Cool.
That's just a handful, but yeah, we have a lot. And, we cater to different grade levels, but
the grade
usually
levels being K through 12? Or?
We do pre-K through 12, yes.
Very
and
cool.
We've worked with other Rotary clubs too, and talked with them about things that are going on. But yeah, we typically tend to introduce a topic and whatever that organism is, and give just broad range information, and then kind of move more into what's happening to them, how are they doing, and then ending with ways that you can help. And what we like to do is really make it like an interaction. So have them first tell you what's happening to them, see what their awareness is of the topic, and then have them first brainstorm solutions. Instead of you just telling them, let them think for a second about what they can do to make a difference. And then we group together and then we discuss it in the next slide of the presentation. A lot of our lessons, we also do activities after just to help with retention. Even if it's a little craft, they can take it home, their parents say, what's this? And then they can teach them a little bit about it too. Just helps them remember it. So we have a marshmallow coral polyp activity that the kids love, but it helps them remember zooxanthellae, coral polyps, nematocysts. They remember it all because they got to eat a marshmallow with Twizzlers and sprinkles. But something basic like that, they can remember it. But we, for the most part, encourage them to cut out their plastic usage, switch to more responsible sunscreens, informing and teaching others, wearing sun shirts, even just creating less waste overall, turning off their lights, like very basic things that they can do. And then we talk a little bit broader, like, hey, write a letter to your government, you know, when your parents are going to the store, have them, you know, make sure that, remind them to bring their reusable bags, you know, maybe go buy something used instead of getting toys from a factory, if you can ride your bike. But then, like, explaining it to that way, it's feasible for them. Like when you tell some kids to ride their bike, especially down here, it's hard because their friends live like 10 miles away. So you can't really do that. But explaining it to them in ways that they can actually make a difference to some degree. And then giving them inspirational stories. So when we did our sunscreen campaign down here, we actually did use a lot of the students in Monroe County. They helped write letters. They made little posters and pictures and sent it to the city commissioners. Some of them showed up. The older ones showed up and held signs. So getting them engaged at different levels is kind of how we work with it.
Cool. So like, so kind of discuss those kind of tiers of involvement, right? So it's like, obviously, you know, probably kindergartners not going right to go to the government, right? But I mean, you kind of describe kind of what you do for each grade level, right? And then kind of and how that manifests in terms of action. I mean, over the course of your time doing this, have you seen maybe a physical difference in the environment because of this involvement, or? Yeah,
so you know, the little ones, we start small, just, you know, use less trash, and I'll do it very like easily because I know this happens in every school. When they dry their hands with a paper towel, use 1, not 20. And you see, when I say that, you see the teachers like nodding their head, and I'm like, okay, I know we have this issue. This was an issue when I was a kid. But even then they're like, oh, okay, just 1 paper towel. Or like, remember your reusable water bottle, or, you know, if you don't really need that toy, maybe, you know, just leave it there. You know, you don't need it. Or make sure that you throw your trash out properly. Don't put food in the recycling. Really basic things that they can understand. And as we kind of get older, we can have them maybe write letters or give the teachers some tools to write letters, or have them start thinking about things that they could do for a science fair project. Then like in more middle school times, we'll do more cleanups with them and things like that. Have them actually write a little bit more letters if the opportunity presents itself. And then, you know, same thing in high school, kind of work their way up there. A lot of our local high schoolers that have done Choral Camp in the past come back and help us. So that is really fun and cool to see. So that's kind of how we do the involvement in that regard. And you definitely do see an impact in the way people are kind of treating the environment, even if it's just the kids are annoying their parents to an extent and being like, hey, you can't do this. One of my favorite things that I like to explain to kids is if you're at a restaurant and, for example, you order a soda, you saying, hey, can I have a Sprite, no straw, please, will probably be more impactful if a child says it versus if an adult says it. Because I would feel that if I'm a server and I have a 7-year-old asking for no straw, please, I'm going to remember that a little bit more rather than if it's just an adult. Because sometimes, like, we did struggle at first. We had a lot of bartenders that if you said no straw, they would take a handful of 10 straws and put them in your drink. But they're not going to do that to a kid. And so things like that, you know. If you have a kid kind of paving the way for an adult, I feel like it's a little bit more eye-opening for that adult.
Absolutely. And, you know, kind of talk about do you have any, when you think of kind of the work you've done, right, and the students you've touched, are there any particular individuals, any particular kind of events that maybe that really stick out in your mind in terms of like either you teaching them something and them doing something about it? Yeah,
so I've been with Reef really for 5 years, and I'm seeing these kids grow up. And I have this one kid who I first taught as a first grader in marathon, and she remembered zooxanthellae is that symbiotic organism inside the coral polyp. So every time I see her after that, she'll come up and tell me, and she'll tell me exactly word for word what it is. I'm like, that's awesome. But you're starting to see a lot of science fair projects now doing a lot more marine related things. Instead of, you know, finding out what the cool YouTuber is doing, they'll look at algal blooms. One of our old coral campers actually did his STEM fair project and is going to the state STEM fair on algal blooms in Key West. You're seeing students do more research on sunscreens and things like that. So you are seeing a shift in these students. You're seeing them be a lot more ocean-minded. We're starting to see a lot of our coral campers go into college and start pursuing marine science. It's still kind of slow because with the timing, they're just now starting to graduate. But we're seeing a lot more of those. So in a few years, we're going to, really try to see, okay, how many of them did pursue marine sciences to some degree, or even if they don't pursue marine science, but if they're using that as something that they want to keep in mind, like even if they do a business degree, they can still make it ocean related. But we are seeing that change in kids' mentalities moving forward, which is awesome.
So, I think the incredible thing you've been mentioning too is it's like, you're kind of using rather complex vocabulary, right? I mean, zoic syntheli, you mentioned a couple other words, right? And it's like, and you're teaching this material to, elementary school students. Some adults can't even wrap their heads around that. How do you make that stick to, with the kids, number one? And number two, it's like, why do you think it sticks? Because, like I said, it's rather complex,
Yeah, when we teach those complex words, we have them repeated a few times. But we also have them, we also have them understand, if they can't say the word, they understand what it does or what it is, and they can explain it that way. But, a lot of them, like when I teach especially, like I try to hype it up and I'm like, all right, I'm going to challenge you guys to remember this word by the end, and it'll make them actually try to remember it a little bit more. But things like that is kind of how we get them to remember it. But even if they don't, if they understand the thought of it and what it is or what it does, that's, a big win for us.
Allergy is a lot easier than
yeah, right?
Like they get it, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So like talk about how you teach, right? So is it just, so I know you're the outreach director, right? But how many people do you work on? How many teachers do you have working underneath you, right? How many times do you do this a week? And then what type of strategies do you use, like for example, the repetition strategies, do you use particularly to kind of get this stuff in these kids' minds?
Yeah, so it is myself and Erin. Erin is doing most of the educational visits currently. She just started with us in the summertime. She was an intern a few years ago, so we hired her on. And as I moved up, so she filled my spot essentially. So it's just her. And so if you actually look at our calendar, we have a class visit pretty much every single day, if not two. So her and I divvy it up. So for example, I'll be doing a public Zoom lesson tomorrow, and she'll be doing another lesson, and I'll be visiting a school and kind of breaking it up. So I do less lessons now because I'm kind of more on the back end booking it and doing a lot of administrative stuff. Because I kind of absorbed the assistant executive director role as well. So kind of working on the back end of it. But the way we do it is we kind of send it out. Like I spent a lot of time looking for different STEM programs in different states and states that may be, or locations that may be more receptive to it. And then reaching out to just a broad range of people and, just throw a bunch of darts and see what sticks. We have a Google form and they request it there, or just by word of mouth they email us. And then typically it's a PowerPoint presentation with interactions. So having kids do hand gestures and asking them questions and having them repeat things, because you can talk at a kid with a presentation and it's very easy for them to not retain it. Yeah. But as soon as if you think about like when you were in school and you were just kind of dozing off and a teacher just asked a question, you're like, oh gosh, she's asking a question, what, I don't know.
I'll do that now.
Yeah, right? So it's like things like that that you kind of think about when you were a student and then moving forward. So that's kind of the techniques that we use, is having them, we've created different hand signals for things. Right. So when we talk about like a mutualistic relationship, we have them put 2 thumbs up and then say it, parasitic, like that. Oh, so it just, cool. It just gets like little things, but it gets them moving a little bit and kind of gets them to actually do something else. Because I do believe in the different learning styles for kids, and I want to be able to appeal to all those. So pretty pictures for the visual learners, auditory by speaking everything, tactile by moving, kinetic by actually doing an activity at the end, and trying to engage as much of those as you can in a lesson is really important.
And how did you kind of develop kind of that foresight to be able to do lesson plans like that? Do you have any background doing any education work, or is it just something you kind of just have inherently known kind of works? Why have you chosen these strategies? Because, I mean, they're rather effective.
Yeah, I just remember growing up that we would always have to take a test and do that. And there was special times where we would have to break into our learning style and do work with that. In college, I did an internship with a sea turtle professor, and I visited a local after-school program, and I did different lessons with different targeted learning styles to see which one worked best. For the most part, kinetic worked best, like doing something, which is not surprising when you're thinking about a kid. But, you know, that's kind of how I thought about it, because, you know, every kid's different, and some kids have more, like, they have different needs compared to other kids, so trying to hit that. But I've always, like, worked with kids. I started off in high school as a swim instructor. I was a Girl Scout, and we had to mentor the younger Girl Scouts. So I've been working with kids for a very long time in different capacities.
Interesting. And what do you kind of see is the biggest kind of gap in kids' knowledge kind of going forward, starting, right? And then what do you see them leaving? What particularly sticks with them the most?
Yeah, I think, you know, once you kind of show them that things are not doing well, that's when it really clicks. So we have a graphic that was published a few years ago, and it says that scientists are predicting that by the year 2050, there's going to be less than 1% living coral left here. And I'm like, yes,
oh, wow.
Yeah, and I really and I put emphasis on that with the kids. I'm like, that's here, guys. That's our reef that we depend on, and I explained to them why the reef is important. So if we didn't have a barrier reef here, we couldn't live here because of the storm protection that it gives us. And when kids start to understand that and how they actually do depend on it, then is when it like starts to become a reality for them, and then they realize that what they depend on is not doing well. And that's kind of how you get them to really understand, or even, you know, just making simple analogies to them so they can understand it. Whether it's, you know, explaining the size of an animal by school buses, or explaining plastic in the ocean compared to stars in the galaxy. So putting in perspective for kids is really what helps them kind of understand. Even if they don't understand the specifics, they can understand something's wrong.
What do they not typically know going in?
I think they just typically don't know how bad it is.
Okay.
And a lot of times they don't realize that what we are doing is causing as big of a problem. And I think, because it's hard, because down here in the Keys, we do, from the surface, it seems like everything's pretty okay. But they haven't seen the reef 20, 40, 50 plus years ago, so they don't know. And also if they have a set of parents that really don't care, or, you know, don't really care about the conservation of these things, and you kind of have that you have to struggle with too. So you kind of have to, those are kind of the bigger issues that you have to address or face or think about when you're talking about this with kids. For the most part, they just don't really realize the scope of the problem. They know that there's a problem, but they don't realize that by the year 2050, which is when they're gonna be alive and still like
Adults,
pretty young, like young adults, like they're gonna be wanting to go on the boat with their friends, and there's not gonna be anything there to go to. And that's kind of when they're like, oh.
So people in the Keys, right, because climate change affects them rather a lot more directly, or a lot faster than other people, right, typically are a bit more environmentally minded than, let's say, someone in Kansas, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of these kids, right, I would imagine, have parents that directly deal with the water in some degree. How do you think that influences maybe the perspective of the kids and the perspective of the people in the Keys overall, as opposed to kind of these other groups in the different states or different countries you're kind of dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone, for the most part, realizes like issues that are going on, but you still do, even down here, experience a lack of acceptance of it, and the lack of wanting to change their lifestyle to make a difference. Like, there's plenty of people here in the Keys that do not believe in sea level rise.
Really?
Yeah, and I mean, when we have a king tide, all out front of our office is underwater. And I can tell you that it wasn't like that when I was growing up. Like, people were not kayaking in the streets all the time. So things like that, and it's, you know, there's a lot of things that you have to unpack when you're thinking about that, because there's a lot of, you know, people that don't believe in climate change. And so you have that going against you. And unfortunately, there's a lot of that here in the Keys still to this day. There was people that were very against us trying to put some regulations on sunscreens here. Even though the science stated facts, they pick the one thing that kind of gives them, that kind of backs whatever argument they have and sticks with it, even though you could have all this other science. And I think we're experiencing that, especially with the pandemic that has happened. You're experiencing a lot of very different opinions, and unfortunately, a lot of these opinions are never going to change. And that's kind of something that we all have to accept and kind of move on and focus our attention and our efforts on other processes. But, I think everyone has seen that, the corals are not doing well, but a lot of it is, well, why is it not doing well? And people will point fingers at many other directions rather than themselves or the core problem at hand. Like even things such as like water quality, that's honestly the biggest issue affecting our coral reef right now. Our water is very dirty. And unfortunately, water quality takes a huge backseat when it comes to recognition and funding. And that's kind of our big push is, our water is dirty. And we have to fix that before we start doing all these other things, but people aren't putting money into it. But yet our sewage is still being pumped into the limestone, which goes into the ocean. They're finding high levels of pharmaceuticals in bonefish. That's not normal. It's a very big problem, and I guess it's because, water quality isn't a very glamorous thing. So people tend to not want to put money into it because it doesn't provide that really beautiful picture that they want. But you're not going to get those beautiful pictures if you don't address the water quality. If we don't fix where our sewage goes, we don't fix what's going on the mainland, all of that is connected. And unfortunately, if we keep kind of moving this route and putting all this stuff into the ocean, it's going to be an issue. And it's going to cause us to have nothing left. And, you can see just the difference in coral coverage between here and the dry Tortugas, which is 70 miles away. And when you compare Garden Key, which is where the tourists go, around like 200 tourists a day for the most part, and then you compare it to the island kind of off of it, that sees maybe 20 people a day, if that, the coral there is insane compared to the coral at Garden Key, compared to the coral in Key West, compared to the coral up the Keys.
So gradient correlated with direct population pressure, right? Wow.
Exactly, and all the other things that are going on. So it was I really observed that on our most recent Big Kids Camp. We take kids out camping in the Tortugas, and we got to go to Loggerhead Key, and I saw some outplanted corals there, and we had just seen a bunch of them off of Key West, and the ones out there were 5 times the size.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I do want to circle back to water quality in just a second, but first off, discuss the similarities and differences in terms of maybe understanding, right, between the people you deal with in the Keys and then the people you deal with in other states and other countries, right? So essentially, are you saying that the people in other states and other countries are understanding it as quickly, as effectively as the people in the Keys, since even though they don't deal with it directly? And if there are, and kind of going back to the host question, right, do you see that their knowledge gap in these areas is a lot different compared to their kind of peers in the Keys?
Yeah, I think when we interact with students in different areas, you see them not knowing about these things that they exist and not understanding that it still impacts them. Like, you say, do you like sea turtles? Well, they need a coral reef. The ocean gives us oxygen, like all these things, like you're breathing right now, it's like all interconnected. So there's a lack of basic understanding as to what it is, what's the problem, and how does it actually impact them. I mean, we have tourists that come down here and stand on the corals because they just simply don't know it's an animal. And that right there, once they realize that's an animal and they wouldn't step on a puppy, like they shouldn't be stepping on that, and they're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. So it's basic knowledge that you have to really introduce to them in that regard for people that don't live here. Here is more so like, to what degree are we willing to make a change in order to counteract this? Because, at the end of the day, like no coral reef will impact us a lot more than it impacts someone in the middle of the country. We won't be able to live here anymore, but we also have to do a lot more. Like we're also, for sea level rise, we're going to have to put a lot of taxpayer money in raising our roads. we have to build up. And so it's, to what degree do you want to change your personal habits or put in your own money for this problem, or is it easier to look the other way? And I think that's kind of what we experience down here, is kind of a mix of that and then wanting to make a change no matter what.
So circling back into all that stuff you were talking about, water quality now, right? I guess can I elaborate on some of the things you were saying before, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, so nitrates and phosphates are a really high pollutant that we're finding in our water here, which is from sewage and fertilizers and pesticides, and all that leaches in. So, especially with like septic tanks, for example, all of the water travels south, even in the mainland. The mainland septic tanks, the way a septic tank works is that it puts that sewage into the limestone, and limestone has holes in it, so it does go into the nearshore waters. So you have things like that are going on. You've got the chemicals found in sunscreens that are also causing an issue and making these corals more susceptible to other things. We've got stony coral tissue loss disease, which is also caused by all that too. You've got pumps that are putting pretty much like raw sewage water into the ocean in South Florida. So there's a lot of things like that, ocean acidification as well. And, we do have, that was interesting. That's a new light bulb, sorry. We do have rising water temperatures. We do have coral bleaching here. I would say that compared to other locations, coral bleaching is not our main issue that we need to be completely focused on. In areas like the Pacific where there's the hole in the ozone layer, that's definitely more of an issue. Whereas here, the coral diseases from poor water quality is, problem number one. And I think that's, again, just drastically avoided.
And, how do you think we can help mitigate the spread of these diseases? I mean, I know you're not necessarily a core scientist, right? But,
yeah.
In your kind of own perspective, how do we go about doing what we can as individuals, community members, to help stop that spread?
I mean, we need to push for our wastewater to be treated correctly. That is a big problem. Even in the Florida Keys, we use shallow water wells that pump into the limestone instead of the deep rock. And you're seeing high levels of different substances in our nearshore waters. So pushing your officials to switch to better wastewater practices. That's a huge thing. Really encouraging people to open up their eyes in that regard and dispose of their waste properly. Like even in our beaches here, a lot of times it's closed for poor water quality and it's high levels of E. coli. So pretty much after a big rain, the beaches are not safe to swim in. And one of the beaches we depend on for coral camp, and last summer we didn't get to go once because it was poor water quality.
Wow.
And that's caused by everything washing off the road into the storm drains, which go directly into the ocean. So whether it's pet waste that they didn't pick up, or all this other waste and just other dirty things that are being put on the ground, that's a huge thing because there's an outfall pipe right by that beach. So all of that is having an impact. But we need to better treat our wastewater. What we're doing right now is just not okay.
How do we push for that? How do we push for that in our community? Is this something we have to talk to the mayor about? Is it something we have to talk to the state about? Who do we talk to? Who do we?
I think it's address? A mixture of things. Yeah. So it's having people understand where their wastewater goes and what the fertilizers and pesticides are doing and how they're impacting. And so having that baseline knowledge to the public so they can make changes, even if it's like stop using fertilizer and pesticides, things like that. And then working your way up. So you need to have a strong backing. So for us with the sunscreen campaign, for example, we actually went door to door in the city of Key West and explained to them hey, this is going on. This is how it's affecting the ocean, but this is how it's affecting humans as well. And getting that strong push. And then we had a letter writing campaign where they wrote letters to our city commissioners. And then going to the city commissioners and having this ordinance get put in place and having people speak and having then the commissioners pretty much vote all in favor of a sunscreen ordinance because, the people in their location asked them to do that. their constituents ask them to pass this ordinance. And starting from the bottom there, getting yourself like a little army, so to speak, to then go to your officials, whether it's, city, county, state, and moving from there is really important. So when recently the state of Florida ended up preempting the sunscreen ordinance, so, our mayor spoke several times encouraging him not to do that and saying, please do not preempt this ordinance. It's not like the citizens voted on this, but unfortunately the state of Florida did vote to preempt our sunscreen ordinance.
And was this recently?
Yes, this was in 2020.
Okay, so
yeah, our ordinance was set to be in place in 2021. But so no city in the state of Florida can do a sunscreen ordinance. It's similar to the plastic bag. So things like that is kind of frustrating. So we're having to do more of an educational campaign. We have an ad that goes into a lot of the Key West hotels. It's like a 1-minute ad, but it teaches people very quickly about their impact on the coral reef and things like that. Because we did actually get a big educational push by doing the entire thing. I mean, we made news, like we were in the news in Vietnam, I remember.
Really?
Yeah,
wow,
from what
amazing.
we did. So
good job.
Yeah, thank you. We had like huge, just like, people really saw us and we were the ones that pushed for it. So people kind of learned that, the sunscreen that we're using is not the best. It's not the best for the ocean, but it's not the best for us. So even though they may still be able to sell those chemical sunscreens, a lot of people are just going to avoid those now. They're going to go for the better stuff.
So kind of talk about that a little bit more, right? This difference between codifying it, which, ideally is probably the best thing to do, but, with the lack of that, trying to just allow people to do things on their own kind of self-responsibility. Talk about discuss kind of the differences in those two strategies and discuss, where it works and where it kind of doesn't work, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So when you're trying to get these things accomplished, you have to think about, well, what's in it for them? Why should they care? At the end of the day, a lot of people are like, well, I'm not a coral. It's not going to affect me, right? But so you explain like, no, the sunscreen still affects you. It's been linked to endometriosis. It metastasized certain cancers. It was the allergen of the year. Like having them be like, oh, I don't want that on my body. And then you're like, okay, well, yeah, so the corals don't like it. It's not good for me. Maybe I should switch. So you do have to think about,
selfishness, right?
Yeah, humans are inherently selfish. We all are, and, that's okay, but we have to cater to that. So, it's just like going to a business owner and our straw campaign. Our first step was just asking them to stop automatically putting straws in drinks. And like, you actually will save money by not using all these straws. I'm not asking you to switch from plastic. I'm just asking you to stop putting them automatically in drinks. Most of the time, people aren't going to care. If they want a straw, they can ask. But most of the time, people are not really going to ask for a straw. But then having them be like, oh yeah, I am actually saving money by just not putting a straw in all the drinks that are being served at this restaurant. You're cutting down, you're saving money that way. And then you slowly be like, hey, you could look really awesome. Like we will, recognize you on social media and, do all this. If you guys switch, we'll show that you are a more environmentally minded business. And again, rewarding people that are doing the right thing is also a really great strategy, no matter what level you're at. So even like down here, like encouraging businesses like, hey, if you don't sell these bad sunscreens, we'll put you on our campaign, we'll recognize you, we'll put you on signage, we'll recommend you. A lot of people come to us, ask for us where they should get certain things. They trust us, we'll recommend you. It's the same with different boat organizations and companies too. We'll recommend boats that have good practices, that, they are doing the best they can. Their mates are actively like teaching the passengers about the ocean. So that's kind of what we kind of go for there.
Rewarding good behavior.
Yeah, like we'll help each other. Like this impacts you just as much as it impacts us.
So ideally, I think a approach between codifying a role and encouraging people to act on their own, accord would probably be ideal. Mm-hmm. Do you think that now that it's essentially possible to codify something like sunscreen, do you still think that it's going to be as effective? Do you think your campaign is still as effective as opposed to if it would have been codified? Does that make sense?
I think it's just like a different
way of doing it.
Yeah, it's just a different way of doing it, and maybe like a different
Do you think it's
a different way of effort, I guess. So, like we're having to put more effort into this more grassroots campaign now. But we already got a lot of work done by pushing it to the city level and a mandated level. And even then, like, we'd still have our own set of issues that we probably would have to face. It would probably get, challenged many years during the season. So your work wouldn't be done regardless. You're still going to have to provide education to people, even if there's a law in place, because a lot of people just don't like being told what to do, especially adults, right? So, if you make a law, they have to follow it more, but is it the inherent, like, I want to break the rules, or they can't tell me what to do and what to put on my body? So you're still having to provide education and have people understand, like, law or no law, it's still a problem and it still impacts you, and you should care.
You touched upon this a bit earlier about the community partnerships you're building. Discuss why that's important, and discuss specifically what community partnerships Reef has built, and the partnerships you've built with your kind of different campaigns you've kind of done.
Yeah, so we have a lot of partnerships, and honestly, we would not be a functional nonprofit without the support of the community. We are a very small nonprofit. Like, we pale in comparison compared to a lot of other nonprofits. Yeah, you see the building. So we rely on a lot of people. In our camp, we rely on the local boat companies to take our campers out. They do it as a donation. So they donate almost 30 trip tickets every Thursday for our campers, every Wednesday, Friday as well. So we really depend on those community collaborations to make our work effective. If we lost those, we would not be successful at all. And it comes with, like, how can we help them? And they're helping us. So whether it's, again, like recognizing them, supporting them, recommending them, it's really, really important and special. We try to keep a really good relationship with other nonprofits and attend their events, so that way when we need help, they'll come and help us too. So it's a give and a take. Like, you can't expect everyone to hand things to you without doing a little bit of work for them. Whether it's putting their logo on your shirt, putting them on social media, attending their events, supporting them, going to schools. We're providing these teachers. Some of these teachers, we teach a week at a time. So that teacher can just sit and hang out for a week and work on their other stuff that they need to work on, and we just take over. And
that works, right?
Yeah, and then in return, when we need a letter for a grant, they're more than willing to write it. And they'll recommend other people, or they'll recommend other schools and teachers that they know, and be like, hey, you'll really like this lesson. Like, my kids loved it.
They'll talk you up in the school board meeting. Or whatever it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it opens other doors, and it's a give and a take. So you have to give something in order to get something back. But we try to keep a good relationship in doing that with everyone, so that way, because again, we're not going to be as effective. It is kind of cool, like here where we are right now, we're actually written into the bite and the lease that there has to be a nonprofit in this area. So we're the nonprofit of
That's
choice.
That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah, and they actually are going to be, the city is going to be tearing down this building and rebuilding us a whole new center in a few years. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So it's things like that,
Center, I imagine, right?
Yes, yes. Yeah. So it's things like that, which is really cool. And you're seeing, what all our work and what we're doing good, and how we have these good relationships with people is, benefiting us and impacting us. It's just really awesome to see.
So the way I interpret it, there's the majority of the public is, let's say, ignorant about issue A, but then there's going to be a smaller segment that's aware of issue A, but is going to deliberately ignore it for the sake of ignoring it. How do you deal with group number one as opposed to group number two? Start answering that question, then we can follow up.
Yeah, I think you have to understand the different arguments. If you don't understand where the person is coming from, you're not going to be as successful. And that's something that I kind of learned from my father, is he understands the viewpoints of others so he can relate it. So I know a lot of people freeze up when they hear the word global warming. So, I like to say climate change, and a lot of people, the argument is climate has always been changing. And I'm like, you are absolutely correct. The climate is changing. It has always changed. It will change when we're gone. But it's changing quicker than it's supposed to be. And so acknowledging what their belief is and what they think that they know, and then providing just a little bit of like, okay, it's changing, but it's changing worse. Changing way more than we've ever experienced before in history. And that's why we should be thinking of something. So it's just understanding where that other party is coming from, because you never want to go to a situation where you're like, you're wrong, you're stupid, this is the facts, because that person's going to shut down. In a sense, you kind of have to inflate their ego and be like, yeah, you're right, like I understand where you're coming from, but what have you thought about maybe this aspect of it or how it could impact that? And that's where you see a lot more success in trying to achieve what you want, is when you understand where that person's coming from. And there may be a deeper reason why they believe that we don't know about. And so it's just kind of slowly unpacking that.
I guess I was also trying to get at this idea that you might, so there's people that know something, that don't know something, but there's also other people that deliberately do know, but deliberately still what's called evil, right? So the oil executive knows that climate change is happening, but you still want to pump in oil. How do you go, and those people are typically those in power, right? So how do you go about changing that,
I think, like, to some degree, you do have to understand, your battles. And unfortunately, some people you cannot change and will never change their ways, especially if they do know and they are choosing to look the other way. And you're always going to have a few bad apples. That's just how it's going to go. So it's understanding where you should put your efforts into, and whether it's, okay, maybe we encourage people to stop buying oil from that person, or going in a roundabout way, or like, hey, you should use this resource instead of this resource more. Maybe it's a bad business owner. Even if it's local, maybe, hey, we just saw them throw a bunch of straws in the ocean, or they were really bad to wildlife. We shouldn't go there anymore. And then you kind of go that way, and then, if they realize that what they're doing is causing the way people see them, and it is starting to affect their finances, and maybe you can make a change in that regard. I do believe that some people you just can't really change, but it's not the end of the world, it's not the end of the fight. You just have to redirect your efforts elsewhere.
So let's start talking about the macro implications of not only what you're doing, but of the role of the keys and corals here overall. So what do you think, education changes the world. How do you think your efforts are going to cause, what do you think your efforts are doing to cause that kind of global, regional kind of change that we're trying to do?
Yeah, so again, I'll go back to the sunscreen campaign where we had a global reach. We were in many news, we were in just many different articles, and so that had a reach there, and people were reading it and learning about this issue. Or the virtual lessons we did on Facebook Live, where we had people from all over the world watching it, when all the parents were stuck homeschooling their kids, not knowing what to do, and providing them with activities and worksheets that they can do, which would preoccupy the kids for maybe 2 hours, but that was 2 hours that the parent didn't have to worry. And again, all over the world. So that's like another way that we're, I guess in a sense, like sometimes the things that we do, we don't realize it's going to have as much of a global reach as it did. Like we didn't anticipate either of those things having such a big reach, but it did, and that's really impactful. Teaching in different states and kind of making the effort to find those contacts. That's kind of, how we're able to make a change in that degree. I feel like we as a nonprofit are, the little ripples that end up going into a big wave. So we may be small, but we do have a large impact with a lot of things that we do. We may not see it instantaneously, but you'll see it over time, or you just have to dig a little bit deeper. You'll see people changing their minds. You'll see other things going into place. You'll see our credibility when we sign on to something, or when we're backing another group or whatever and asking people to do something different. You'll see those things more come to light that way.
So elaborate more on how small organizations like this have a big impact. How do you think... Okay, answer that question first.
Yeah, I mean, it's just about your passion. We're all really passionate here. We all love the ocean for whatever reason. Somehow, somewhere, someone introduced us to the ocean, and we decide that we love it. I mean, working for a nonprofit, you're not doing it for the income. You're doing it because you care about what difference you're going to make. And I tell everyone that, starts to work here, I'm like, you're doing this because you care. And as long as people care, then that group of one can make a big difference. it's just your passion. If you're not passionate about something, then it's not gonna have an impact. You're just going through the motions. But people that are passionate about something will go the extra mile. They'll be passionate when they speak, which will engage others. If you just go up and talk about a coral reef to kids in a monotone voice, they don't care. But if you're enthusiastic about it, you're kind of infecting them with your appreciation and your excitedness of it. So that's kind of like how I would say that small groups can make an impact. It's just about your passion. There's long days sometimes. You're working after hours. You're doing different things. But if it results in the end goal of providing education, awareness, whatever, then so on and so forth. During the sunscreen thing, like all of us were having nightmares like every night about the sunscreen and about people from big pharmaceutical companies coming down and all this stuff. So, you lose a lot of nights sometimes depending on what you're working on, but it's all for the end goal. And then that end goal, like when they voted yes on that ordinance, was super fulfilling. Like everyone was hugging and cheering. Like it was a great feeling, like one of the best feelings working here. But just keeping that passion is how small groups, even one individual, is going to make a big effect.
I think the example you've mentioned about Vietnam is a really powerful example of kind of taking these small little movements and applying them globally and regionally. How you can take something and you can kind of model it rather everywhere in the world, because coastal communities, no matter if you're in Vietnam or America or in Africa or the Mediterranean, they essentially have the same essence, the same foundation of needs of culture. I mean, there's a reason why fishing cultures across the globe are more or less the same, roughly. So this idea of taking these small things and modeling after one another, I think is just the most amazing thing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any questions, Adolfho?
I've been kind of scratching the questions that you've been asking. I'm like, oh God, okay. One of the questions that I had: how has COVID-19 impacted Reef Relief overall? Have you guys had more business, less business, more students, less students?
So it's a weird experience for us, but I do think, to back up a little bit, I think COVID taught everyone that we need to be adaptable. And if we can't adapt, then you're not going to make it happen. And so we had to adapt, and that was going virtual. That was providing these free lessons, which then ended up opening our doors and really just changed us for the better. We're able to experience and visit so many more students now because we realized that we can do it virtually, and we were doing it at the time that everyone was kind of struggling with virtual stuff. And if you messed up, they're like, all right, it's cool, we're all learning. So we got that learning time to really be able to create awesome virtual content. We have people that are learning about us because maybe a funder who their grandkid was watching us in the other room, or we have campers that are coming down because they watched us during COVID when we did all those lessons, and they're like, we are coming down for the week in the summer, we want to bring our kids to camp. So it really did open our doors, and a lot of more people learned about us. So I say for us, COVID really forced us to modify and adapt to what's going on. And then it's helped us change a few things, even if it's small things. Like some things that we're doing now, I was like, especially in camp, I'm like, I don't understand how we did this before. Like, even if it's so small as like numbering the kids' cubbies, we usually just like let them put their stuff in the cubbies. But with COVID, we had them separate it. It makes so much more sense now because when they leave something, you know exactly whose it is. So like little things like that, it's taught us to be a lot more efficient. We've really kind of learned a lot, and we've grown a lot.
All right, awesome. Another thing, I did look at the schedule over here, and it says spring break coral camp. What happens during that camp session?
So we have we have spring break, and then we have our summer camp.
Okay.
So throughout the week, it's a day camp. We have about 20 kids. Throughout the week, they are here, and they're learning different marine science topics like the ones that I told you about. We have a little theater that we do a presentation in. We do activities outside, activities in here. There's usually a field trip every day. So on Mondays, we typically take them to the aquarium to practice their ID. It's just down the street. On Tuesday, we do our snorkel school at the beach, or if the bad water quality, to the pool. Make sure they understand how snorkeling works. We break them into small snorkel teams at that point based on skill that we think they may have, because we don't want to put like an advanced snorkeler, freediver, whatever, with someone who is just learning for the first time. Otherwise, they're going to have a terrible experience. So we do the snorkel school with them, and then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday are all boat trips where we take them out to the sponge gardens or the reef, And again, they're with little snorkel teams with an adult at all times. And again, they're just getting lessons and activities and games throughout the week as well. And we try to change up our lessons a little bit. We have like older or younger and more advanced or less advanced topics, so that way, you know, they can learn new things, because we have a lot of campers that do it every single year. But that's in a nutshell. And we also have our Big Kids Coral Camp, which is for kids that have kind of phased out of our regular camp, older kids. And we actually take them camping in the dry Tortugas for 3 days, 2 nights. They get to meet professionals working in the field, and it's more science-based. So we have them actually have a journal, and they have to make observations after every single dive and snorkel. So compared to here and over there, and they have to compare the health of the coral, the status of the fish. So it's much more challenging them to be actual scientists. So that's a really fun camp.
How much do you charge for these camps?
So our regular coral camp is $250, or if there is, like, we have a student in a multi-week discount, and it's from 8 to 5 essentially. And everything's included except for their lunch. They have to bring their own lunch. And then Big Kids Camp is around $400 to offset the trip out there, because it's a little bit expensive, and we supply all the food and water when we're out there, so we have to buy all the groceries and cook.
Yeah. I guess my final question would be, you were talking about campaigns and like the sunscreen campaign. What other campaigns either that went through and it was successful, or others that have not been successful? What are some of those campaigns?
Yeah, so the biggest one is our straw campaign. We started with just a campaign throughout the Florida Keys called Skip the Straw Florida Keys, and we got many businesses to sign on. It was so successful that in the city of Key West, you cannot give out a plastic straw. If a business is doing that, then they can actually get a fine. So we got that.
Awesome job.
Yeah, so that was awesome. So now we just kind of have the campaign for the rest of the Keys, because it ends outside of Key West.
Okay.
But that was a really successful one. A long time ago, Reef Relief was involved in the channel widening, and I think that got successfully denied because they didn't want to widen the channel, so Reef Relief was on board with that. So, I mean, there's so many campaigns and things that we want to jump on, but a lot of times it's hard when you have a staff of 4, and Aaron, 2/4 of it, half of it is in a school a lot of the time, so, you know, there is a give and take there. But I would say like the straw one is more recently one of our more successful ones.
So, what does the word conservation and sustainability mean to you, given your background? Those are two rather loaded words, but in your own perspective, not necessarily a definition, but like I said, and the way you interpret it, what does that do? How does it resonate?
Yeah, so it's conservation and sustainability. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so conservation, I believe, is protecting things for a greater good or a greater goal. And conservation, is keeping that long term. So whether you're conserving a population so that it's available long term. Sustainability, on the other hand, I guess it's very similar, but sustainability is more so, keeping something essentially sustainable. So that would be kind of a bad definition there, but, trying to keep it ongoing and sustaining that, whether it's like the knowledge and the momentum that you have with the topic. So just keeping that going. I would say like those are kind of how I would define the two.
And what does the term sustainable development mean to you?
I think sustainable development is progressing within society, but keeping it in a way that we will not crash as a society. So whether it's, we have to build housing because people cannot afford to live here anymore, but if we can't build housing everywhere in our environment, because then we'll have no environment left, and our city cannot take all those people coming in and people moving. So it's just, as how I would kind of say sustainable development is moving forward, but also understanding that you have to protect things and keeping the overall picture in mind.
And I guess the last question I have, I guess the last thing I want to ask you is, to anybody that's listening right now, right, what do you have to say, any kind of last thoughts to the world?
Yeah. Yeah, so I would just say that, there's a lot of bad things happening with our environment, and sometimes it may seem very too much to handle. It's kind of just doom and gloom, but it's not. there's so many things that every single person can do to make a difference. No action is too small. Just one little change can, again, be that ripple effect to make the big wave. So I would just say, when you may be feeling discouraged and you may feel like people aren't listening to you or things are not as great as you once remembered them, like, keep on going. Because if everyone has felt that at some point, and if everyone kind of gave up when they felt that, then the world would be a much darker place. But we need people to keep fighting the good fight and, even try and keep going even when it gets a little bit tough.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's it. Yep.
Awesome.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.